because preparing the presentation, I poured some coffee over the keyboard of my computer, which doesn't go down very well. So, but we managed now to bring the questions together. I would like to call the representatives of the different sessions to come on stage. We have Hans Gusens, who is working with Yara International. He is the president of the new business section, who is in charge of an innovation platform around water scarcity. We have Roger Falconer. He works for the International Association for Hydro, Environmental Engineering and Research. He's the president of the association. For the civil society, would like to call Bert Devos. He's the president of the World Water Use Parliament for Water. And Richard Lawford for academia. Please come on stage and give them a clap. Yes. Well, the way how we are going to organize this session, we have 1 hour and 15 minutes. So we discussed yesterday. We will present 3 questions. Each of our panelists will answer the question from his session, from the different perspectives which were discussed yesterday. And I have to be very dictatorial in terms of timekeeping. Having 1 hour and 15 minutes and 3 questions to answer by 4 panelists means we have 45 minutes to answer these 3 questions. Each panelist will have about 4.5 minutes to answer his question. Then we will present you with an overarching question and have half an hour for discussion to open the panel, to open the floor for all the evaluated audience. So the first question is, what technologies and approaches were presented in your stakeholder session of the conference yesterday, which contribute to the effective implementation for each of the different targets for the Sustainable Development Goals? And as I have them here on my list, Hans, I would like you to take the floor in the first place.
Thank you. In our business session, actually, we passed through 4 technologies. And maybe before starting to name them, it's good to remember that with technology, we are not just referring to physical equipment as such, but we're also referring to the knowledge, the techniques, and the skills that surround the deployment and use of the technology. So actually, the first technology which was touched upon, actually, were publicly available web-based tools developed by NGOs, academia, and often funded by either public or private finance. And I would say this is a perfect response to the call of the Secretary General, who proposed to establish an online global platform building on and complementing existing initiatives and with the participation of all relevant stakeholders in order to map existing technology facilitation initiatives, needs and gaps, enhance international cooperation and coordination, and promote networking, information sharing, knowledge transfer, and technical assistance. Indeed, the examples we have seen included one, for instance, from CDP, where it is not just about information. It's a lot also about understanding what the data mean, assessing the risk, actually, in order to be able to use this technology to prioritize the actions. And I noted down very much also the fact that businesses are invited to indicate actually what is the value at risk. And this is then brought together at the river basin level, which means that that brings together the people, the different actors, the different stakeholders around the river basin to make sure actually that actions are not counteracting each other's effects, but that they are a sort of an initiative for coming to a global collective action whereby problems are solved at the river basin. In that extent, also good to mention for me was the CEO of the Mandate Water Action Hub, which is actually inviting different business actors to upload their projects so that they can find it, again, at the same river basin level, that they can find other projects, other partners who are interested to work in that area, and so to come to collaborate to collective action. Second technology, drip irrigation technology. A nice example from the Inter-American Development Bank sugarcane project in Jamaica, where flood irrigated sugarcane is transformed into drip irrigated sugarcane, increasing water efficiency twofold easily. And I noted down there the importance of actually looking into the broader context and not just looking into just irrigation efficiency, but seeing in the opportunities that this brings to also increase nutrient use efficiency, fertigation efficiency, and look into the total crop water productivity. A third technology, wastewater treatment with Veolia, where I was particularly charmed by the statement that, okay, technology development and upscaling of technology went very well, very good. But I was charmed by the fact that it was mentioned that it was due to the fact that they had a specific attention on working with the local people. Meaning that capacity building is indeed a very important aspect of making sure that technology is successfully implemented. But there was a concern on keeping momentum beyond the project phase, underlining actually that capacity building is more than just at the project phase itself. And the last technology, still on time, was seawater desalination, a project for actually making drinking water available in Ghana from Abengoa. Again, there, technology is there, the challenge is there. Were definitely related to the financing, whereby actually public-private partnership was there with the World Bank seen as one of the key levers actually to make sure this technology was implemented.
Well, thank you very much, Hans, and thank you very much for keeping to the time schedule. Easy business, effective. So, please, Roger, from the perspective of governments, what were the key technologies that were presented and discussed yesterday in your session?
Well, I come here as a hydro-environmental engineer. I'm delighted to be here. But I have to say we didn't really get into the details of the tools in my session. But as an aside, in the context of how the modelling came up, there were a number of points which were clear. We talked, for example, about the Zaragoza River, where the flow went from 0 to 2,500 cubic meters per second in 1 hour. And we have the tools. They weren't actually discussed, but to model that extreme event. So we would need to treat that in the same way that we would model an aircraft flying supersonically with shock capturing skills. And in fact, one of the world's leading authorities on shock capturing is here at the University of Zaragoza. But what did come out of yesterday, for me, indirectly, through the lack of discussion, perhaps, of the tool details, is that we need to raise the profile of agriculture. When I look at the expertise that's going into hydro-environmental modelling of things like flash floods, there's not the same level of expertise being put from the fluid flow point of view into things like raising the profile, raising the efficiency of agriculture. And a huge amount could be done in this area when I look at the skills that are in my discipline through the International Association for Hydro-Environmental Research. And if I just look at the Formula One cars as an example, last year, 2013, the cars only had 200 litres that they could use in any particular race, and no car failed to complete the race. In 2014, that was dropped from 200 litres to 100 litres, and still no car failed to complete the race because of lack of fuel. Now, I find it incredible that the efficiency of the car engine has improved dramatically. I could take the same with the Airbus A380 and the Boeing flights. The huge advances are made in those fields. So we can attract the best brains in computational fluid mechanics into those areas, but we can't get those people to work in improving agriculture. There are huge benefits we could make in refining the drip system so we could get much more crop for drop if we could bring these people in to apply those tools, hydroinformatics tools, into this area. Myanmar talked about capacity building. My experience has been very often that a person in a certain government rings up a friend in another country, and we don't always end up with the best expertise helping many people in developing countries, in my view. So I think organisations like my own, the International Association for Hydro-Environmental Engineering Research, have a huge contribution to make here. We have big databases of all the expertise, and if we can get people to bring in the right expert rather than some government official ringing up some crony in Britain, for example, and getting somebody who really knows very little about the topic to go to that country and help them, we could solve and contribute significantly to the Millennium Development Goals. Also risk assessment. We had a very good presentation on risk assessment, but so often in my experience, risk assessment is used weakly as a tool to simplify the models. Well, we must have a simple model. It needs to run in real time. We'll run it time and time again and so forth because we have to satisfy the requirements of risk assessment. Risk assessment is extremely important, but often we simplify the models to such an extent that it's the poor that suffer in my experience. Thank you.
Well, you know, saying business is more efficient. Governments were even more efficient. Governments managed to bring in the key message in less than the allocated time. Thank you very much, Roger. Richard, please elaborate from the perspective of academia. What are the key tools and instruments you were discussing yesterday?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Academics, of course, think of problems a little differently, maybe talk a little longer.
If government concedes to give you the extra minute, you're fine.
Okay. But basically, we try to assess problems, understand the processes involved, and design solutions. And then other people are major components in delivering on those solutions often. I think if you review the various SDG targets within the water SDG, we have a lot of technology developed in support of WASH, thanks to the heritage of the Millennium Development Goals. And it was evident from the presentations in the WASH discussion that these technologies are reaching a certain level of maturity. There was discussion of the UpGrow program, manual drilling techniques, sensors for measuring urban water quality, the application of MODIS and radar satellite data to identify areas where groundwater drilling could take place to discover new water sources. So a sophisticated approach, but one point that came up is that there has to be an assessment of those technologies because some of the groundwater pumping capabilities that were put in place about 3 or 4 years ago are now found to be rusted and non-functional. And so it's not just putting technologies in, but maintaining those technologies over time. In terms of the wastewater and water quality discussions, there was interesting examples put forward on the roles of technology in treating water. It's been quite effective in a number of areas for a number of contaminants, but there are still problems, particularly for viruses and pathogens in the water. These things seem to be pretty hard to get rid of, and so there needs to be continual development in that area. In the area of water management, there are methodologies related to evaluating the effectiveness of irrigation, methods to calculate the water footprint. There were suggestions that we need to look at storage of water on the large scale as critical for meeting multiple process demands such as irrigation and hydropower. And we do have tools through remote sensing thanks to many national space agencies. These tools provide high-resolution data that could be very effectively used in sustainable development applications. In the area of integrated water resource management in ecosystems, there weren't as many technologies to put on the table, but hopefully that'll be rectified in the near future. Thank you.
Well, you claim to need more time. You used 3 minutes out of 4.5, so talking about tools and technologies, maybe it's the way forward, to do more with less. Well, finally, please, Bert or Bart, answer our question, which we have put on the screen from the perspective of civil societies.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think I want to start this intervention with the quote of, I think she's in the room, of Professor Nini Tain yesterday. I think it was at the end of the day we had the quote that technology, in fact, is only 50% of the problem, of the solution. And I think this is well reflected also in the time we spent in our discussions. In fact, we focused as civil society rather on the enabling conditions for successful technological interventions instead of trying to come up with a long list of examples of technologies. So we have really had, I think, some good discussions on what is required for a technological intervention to be successful, not only in terms of hardware and infrastructure, but also in terms of taking into account the local context. So maybe before giving 2 concrete examples of technological interventions which we have discussed yesterday, I want also to repeat what has been said multiple times in our civil society session, namely that we believe that local wisdom is a tool at itself. And specifically for technology, it means that we consider that a real successful technology intervention must incorporate the local wisdom of communities, so to avoid that in a local community a certain technology is implemented or introduced without guaranteeing that it is in line with the local context. So more than just integrating local wisdom in existing technologies, we also think that there is an unlocked potential for local wisdom and experience to be the very base of the development of new technologies. Then maybe just some 2 brief examples. In the context of water disasters, we saw a case study of Bangladesh presented by Lydia Komiski, who was a youth delegate to this conference. And in fact, we concluded that the technology in this case was very useful in warning local communities and thus reducing the negative impacts of floods. And specifically in the case presented, we thought that the local context had really been investigated, and it was concluded that warning the people through cell phone communication was most appropriate. And so to avoid unequal access to this information that was diffused, we saw that the technology did take into account the problem of illiteracy and the fact that a considerable part of the society can only receive phone calls and no text messages. So, and then it was also discussed that the technology had no added value unless it is understood by the local community. In the project presented by Lydia specifically, there was a considerable focus on training the local community to understand the information, to respond to it, and to react appropriately. And a second short example of technology which we have been examining is drip irrigation. We had a case presented by Mr. Ali Zain from Aga Khan Foundation in a Syrian context. And we saw how modernized drip irrigation was introduced to respond to the water shortages. And it was concluded that this intervention could not be successful unless the local farmers were informed about the groundwater problem and unless they understood the problems and the risks of the lowering groundwater levels. So to ensure that they really adapt their agricultural practices beyond just having the new technologies. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bart. And I particularly like to hear this from the perspective also of youth, because I think everyone who has passed 40 amongst us has had to face this challenge. You unwrap a new computer, you unwrap a new technological toy. You don't go through the manual because we don't do this, you're a stupid man. But then you get stuck and you ask your kids, can you help me? And that's the intuitive approach to do it. Well, thank you very much. So let's go to the next question. The next question is, what are the conditions for to successfully replicate and effectively implement the technologies, the tools which have been discussed in a different context in terms of different geographical context, different hydrological context, different institutional context, and so on, so that we can scale them up and or we can achieve a trickling down effect in order to allow these good practices to foster better implementation in support, again, we are preparing for the SDGs, so in support of the water-related SDGs. And again, Hans, please elaborate what you've discussed in this context from the perspective of business.
Yeah, we said actually that business is involved at 3 levels. First, as water users. We had the example of BASF, who were showing their program on water stewardship, where just quoting that actually from water management to water stewardship is going from in between your factory gate to outside your factory gate. So one role of the business as a water steward. Second role, business as a technology provider. We've seen the technology of water desalination, of wastewater treatment, but also business as a technical and operating partner for public water installations. So the business has a threefold role to play. And actually, throughout our discussions, it was clear that the successful implementation is dependent on how good we are at thinking beyond our own boxes and acting collectively, but also looking outside the traditional water box. As I have mentioned before, on the example of the other example of the drip irrigation equipment, it's not just looking into how you effectively reduce the water, but look into the total agricultural practice, the total crop productivity, just as an example. We were actually having also the example of Nestlé, who was working in Vietnam and in Colombia on coffee, where they were working on improving the water use efficiency, not just for irrigation, but also for the washing and the processing of the beans. And that has an impact on drinking water availability in the area directly. The other role of the business on how to, let's say, make sure that the human right on wash is fulfilled is not forgetting about the H, about the hygiene. And we had a discussion around that. Actually, we see that when acting in developing countries, that business can play a fairly introductory role in bringing basic hygiene routines to the population. By just making sure that in the factory, at the site, the right habits are trained and explained why to use, and people bring that home. Experience is there, as told from Nestlé, and I can say also from within my company, experience is there, whatever you show that you care for the people, whether it is hygiene or safety or security, they bring this home to their own family and to their own community. Yeah, I think that was what I wanted to say about the role of business in bringing actually water and access and hygiene to the society.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. Roger, please elaborate from the perspective of governments. What was discussed yesterday in your session? What are the conditions that we really can replicate it? All these tools.
I need every bit of the 4 minutes. Well, this was my last question on the list I've got, and for me this is the fundamental question, because I feel that we will never achieve these sustainable development goals unless we really focus on the water footprint. Because there was much talk in my session about the water, energy, food nexus, and particularly focusing on water and energy. And the world has become obsessed with the carbon footprint, which is a good thing. But it's been taken out of context because we don't talk about the water footprint in my country, for example. And I think all the tools that are available for the water footprint could be really dramatic in terms of addressing the sustainable development goals. But the problem is we're getting down into technical levels of detail. Does a pair of jeans require 75 bars of water, each 150 litres, or does it require 70? Academics start arguing over this. Politicians say, these academics can't agree, let's walk away. And I believe that if we were to shift towards a traffic light system, similar to when you buy a fridge, for example, in my country, you have green, which means it's very carbon friendly. It's red, it's terribly unfriendly. So people then try to think about the carbon footprint, and I think we should look at the water footprint too. So when people in the UK realise, for example, that a shirt requires as much blue-green water as, say, 50 bars of water, 150 litres each, and that cotton is produced in a developing country using the blue-green water and converting it to grey water, etc., then people question, should Manchester United, which is a huge global brand, be changing its shirt every year, for example? If we could persuade Manchester United to change its shirt every 2 years, for example, to make a big difference. So I believe there's a lot can be done here with the tools that we have for the water footprint. And I think the biggest challenge of all, bigger even than climate change, is the increasing wealth in countries like China and India, and where these people want to follow Western habits, which, for example, means that when I used to go to China 20 years ago, every woman had the same dress on, the same uniform, and they wore that day in, day out. Now they're wanting to become westernized, and there's nothing wrong with that, and I can understand that, but they're shifting to a situation where they're changing their clothes and wearing a different dress every day. And that has a huge impact on water security, water pollution in many third world countries, because that's where the cotton comes from. So I believe that the tools for the water footprint should be geared up towards a traffic light system indicating high levels of water footprint and so forth, so that the world can become much more aware of the impact of virtual water. We don't produce any cotton in my country. Everybody wears different clothes every day of the week and so forth, and that has a huge impact in the Sustainable Development Goals, in my view, and if we're to address those.
Thank you very much, Roger. Again, that's a message I take home to my teenage boys. They're still youngsters, and there is a fight in convincing them about changing their clothes still. They're not yet reached the age where they really want to change. So I say, you can contribute to the SDGs, just stay as you are. Thank you very much, Roger. Richard, please, from the perspective of academia, what are the obstacles you've noticed yesterday in your session?
Okay, obstacles or conditions for success?
Oh, the conditions for successfully replicate.
Okay.
We come to the obstacles in the next step. I know we changed a little bit that, but I think it makes sense. What's there? What is the conditions for replication, upscaling, and then why doesn't it happen? Because that's, in the end of the day, why we're here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, in our discussions, scale issues came out as being quite important. Scale's a major consideration because a lot of the solutions are local, and yet the information that is needed to drive those solutions is global or national. And the effects of the solutions as they're introduced accumulate, and they accumulate up to the national level and sometimes up to the global level. That's positive, but it also can be negative if the thing that is underlying the problem is not addressed fully. So we need to be able to upscale and downscale with a certain amount of ease and facility. Global information on climate change, for example, can provide guidance, but it has specific weather implications. It has implications for extremes, which happen very suddenly. So we need to be able to take what is available globally and apply it locally with confidence that we have reduced the uncertainties to a level where the information is usable. Hydrogeology is another area where we need to be able to go from the global scale down to the local scale. And so high-resolution data is very important for interpreting that global-type data. And validation data at specific sites is also very important. In terms of the ability to scale, we also need to think about the interactions of water with other environmental conditions, with other sectors. For example, we've heard about water, energy, and food. Clearly, there are scale issues involved there in terms of defining the interactions between those sectors. There are issues of scale when we talk about land management, water management, and ecosystems. We have to be able to address scale. So from an academic point of view, that's an important issue to address. Then there's the way forward in terms of replicating technologies. There were examples of how demonstration projects could be done in one area, and then that could be transported or transferred into other areas, provided the context was right. That is, the right climate, the right geography, the right cultural factors, the right economic conditions. Those are all contextual and determine whether the transfer of technology is going to be successful. Capacity building has to be part of this as well, so that the capacity is there to receive the technology in the new area that's where it's being transferred. And then we also looked at, not too much specifically, but it was an underlying issue there. How do we popularize and make people aware of solutions that exist in one area and transfer them to another? And undoubtedly, social media provides a great platform for doing that. We haven't developed it yet, but it's there and it's open to our use. And we should make sure that as the SDG indicators and targets are developed, that we make full use of social media. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. But from the perspective of civil society, what have you discussed yesterday? What are the conditions that these tools, which are there, can be upscaled, can be used, can be applied?
Yep, thank you. Well, we discussed a lot more about the obstacles than about these conditions for success to replicate, so I think I'm going to use some of my time
there
later in the
will be another question on the obstacles later on,
okay.
because, you know, that's what's here, that's what we need to do to upscale it, but why doesn't it happen?
Yeah.
In the
Well,
end of the day, why
as civil society, mainly we agree, of course, that there is a need to scale up good practices, and we need also, as civil society, to have more exchange between local actors also, not only at national or government of UN system level. This is fundamental. And talking about the conditions for successfully replicating, we think that when replicating, we should not only be looking at the geographical conditions and the hydrological or institutional conditions and compare these conditions. We should also, and as much as we look at the other conditions, compare the social conditions, the social dimension of the thing, look at the community where we want to replicate things. Because one of the big problems when successfully implementing new technologies, one of the problems that results in failure of technological intervention is poor management. So if, when talking about replicating technologies, we do not look at the management capacities of the other communities, then we have a problem. So it's important, as much as comparing the geographical and the institutional conditions in that other context, also to compare what are the concrete cultural conditions, social conditions, management capacities of the local communities, if we want to successfully proceed to implementing those technology tools in different contexts. And then maybe just to conclude on which role as civil society we can play in being a catalyst for this replication. Of course, I agree with the previous panelist that certainly for us as young people, for instance, social media are a great tool. But looking more process-wise, I want to rephrase a little bit the remark of one of our great panelists yesterday at the end of the day in a civil society session, Jean-Bosco Bazier from OVIF, Director General, and he said that he made some remarks on participation. And these participation, I believe that participation of civil society is very important if you want to have the chance to replicate and to valorize the experiences that we have at local level. And what Jean Bosco said about participation, I think that it cannot be denied. He said that nowadays everybody agrees that participation is necessary, that it is a condition to success. Everyone agrees on it, everyone likes it, everyone finds it sexy, but that is where it stops. And we still miss very often from local to national level the conditions for enabling meaningful participation. So decision makers confirm that participation is important, but they do not act accordingly. They don't provide the support for making participation possible. And the problem is sometimes very absurd, like a lack of seats in a meeting room or a lack of financial support for transport costs. So if you want to enable civil society to play a more useful and more effective role in replicating these good examples we have at local level, we need to work on this. And I'm repeating what has been said a lot at conferences, but it remains a problem, we think, as civil society. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bart, and I think well heard the message. Well, now we've heard about the tools which were presented. We've heard about what needs to be done to upscale it, trickle down, to replicate it in different contexts. Yet, we are still facing a situation where water is becoming scarce in most parts of the world. So, what are the obstacles? Why doesn't it really happen? Why do these beautiful tools, why can't they be applied everywhere? Why can't we solve all the problems by using these tools and technologies? And again, Hans, please, in the first place, what was discussed from the perspective of business yesterday in your session?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, we discussed that the barrier is not the availability of the technology as such. There is still a lot of potential for innovation and for further technology development. But if we only would implement or have implemented the technology which is already available for more than a decade, I would say, we would have come far further than where we are today. And we discussed about, you could say it was about financing, but as financing is the subject after the break, I will not take away all the arguments from my colleague Jack, but turn it into the fact that we discussed actually the business case for investment is often where people are struggling with to get to the decision of, yes, we are going to invest in this technology. And if the business case is there, we do believe also that the financing will be there. At least that is how it works in business internally. If we are able to show a good enough business case, management is always available to find the money to go for the investment. And we had a very interesting example, actually, again from the Inter-American Development Bank on the sugarcane project in Jamaica, where they were also struggling with identifying actually for the farmers why should they invest in an expensive drip irrigation technology. On top, it was not just about investing in drip irrigation technology, it was also investing in mechanical harvesting of sugarcane. And actually what this project in Jamaica for me was really an eye-opener, was that they used a sort of a staged process actually to use donor finance in order to enable actually at the latest stage to bring in private capital. And the donor finance is used to make the business case, to elaborate the business case. And the business case in this case was very much, again, looking into the total picture. It's about the amount of water which was saved. It's the effect on then having more water available for the local society. The mechanical harvesting machine means that you can stop the practice of cane burning on the field, which has an effect again on the local environment. So you had a lot of positive effects, and you would increase the productivity of the land. And it's in that total agricultural productivity that the business case was shown to be positive. But again, there it was for me quite a nice mechanism to see how actually donor grants were used to build the business case. Veolia came with a good example on saying that, well, we have been very successful in emphasizing not just the capex, the capital expenditure, the investment, but also what are the savings on the operational cost afterwards. Quite basic, but still important to remind. And then missing the right incentives. Sometimes the right incentives are missing. You could say, well, we had a discussion about water is too cheaply priced. But in that discussion, we said, yeah, okay, we subscribe indeed to the conclusion that we plead for fair pricing of water for agricultural, industrial, and domestic use, but assuring at the same time that this pricing allows to assure human right on access to wash. And besides missing the right incentives, actually very often we see that there are still the wrong incentives for going for the non-sustainable solution. As for instance, taking the example of the IDB, we often see that standard banks, they are very quicker, very faster, much faster on giving loans as they see that the business case is good enough, without really going to look into whether the total solution is indeed a sustainable solution. And IDB or others, they are more strict. They will go more. They take more time to really look into the sustainability of the total project, which means that they may miss out, and the investment is going to the non-sustainable solution. So to conclude, I think I have a few seconds left. Some of these barriers could be overcome by having also more regulatory pressure and making sure that the pressure is going to the right solutions. That is from the regulations. Strange to hear it from the business, you could say. But we do believe so. Besides that, there can also be done positive pressure from the international business society, setting standards, certificates, voluntary or non-voluntary, on sustainable goods produced in a sustainable way, so that the buyer is actually putting pressure.
Thank you very much, Hans. Roger, from the perspective of governments, what are the obstacles that all these beautiful tools which are available are not being applied to effectively combat water scarcity and the problems we face in achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, as an academic, I could speak for 6 weeks on this, but I will just focus on one point, if I may, and that's data. I think we need to really look at how we can transform the whole culture of data transformation between one country and another, with the exception of the United States, which does it well and sets a very good example. We need much better data. We need much better input from experts involved in data acquisition. We have increasing problems, in my experience, of acquiring data from one country to another. IP has become a nightmare. I started my academic life 37 years ago, and it was very easy to get data. Today, it's virtually impossible. I could measure all the furniture in my room, the height and dimensions of all the furniture, and within 5 minutes, the legal department will come over and say, we must protect this, we must have a non-disclosure agreement before you pass it to anyone. We must try to overcome this challenge. It's a massive challenge, in my view, of IP. IP is getting worse and worse and worse. And another point is that increasingly modelers need to be engaged with the data. Too often the data is collected, and then when the modeler comes along, one doesn't have the right data over the last few years. And also the people that acquire the data need to have a better appreciation from the modelling perspective. In my country, for example, our regulatory authority goes out typically once a week and measures the temperature and the coliform levels and so forth in rivers. Well, to measure temperature once a week is fine because it probably doesn't change much over a weekly period. But coliforms are very episodic and they need to be monitored continuously or not at all. It's pointless collecting coliform data in a river once a week, for example. So we can make huge strides, in my view, in improving the water quality modelling, which affects many parts of the world. I've been involved heavily in Ghana, and we're working quite closely with people in Ghana, improving the water quality modelling. But there needs to be much better integration between the data acquisition and the modelling tools that are used to replicate that. To a certain extent, I think the problem is with the water utilities. Either water needs to be controlled by the government, where I think it can be easier to transfer the data, or if it is funded privately, as it is in my country, we need more competition because then we will get much more investment by the water companies. Thank you.
Wow. Half the time allocated used. Thank you very much, Roger, for being so efficient. Richard, from the perspective of academia, why don't we roll out these tools? Why don't we have the big success we want to have? Why do we still need to have sustainable development goals? Why we haven't achieved the sustainable development yet?
Okay, well, in our discussions, we touched on several different issues that are kind of obstacles. One dealt with funding or priorities for funding. A second one was the collaborations and the role that the academics could have if more collaborations were developed. And then there was some internal introspection about how scientists could be more involved if the incentives were set better for their involvement. So in the case of funding, it's recognized that governments are facing challenges in getting development funds to go forward with activities, and at the same time we're bringing the SDGs forward, so it's going to be a challenge, I think, to get nations to commit fully. And sometimes development funds are not used in the wisest way. At least that's the academic perspective. And it's thought that if there were more assessments done, that they could maybe steer development agencies to invest more wisely, particularly in the developing countries. And part of that would be to support the academic development of water programs at universities in the developing world. And there was also a point raised that we have a short-term perspective from national governments often because the elected officials have to produce something in a certain term of office, and that the investments that are needed to really address sustainable development goals are long-term investments. So there needs to be a broader perspective brought to the table, and perhaps the UN can help with that. Academics feel they have a strong role to play in technology development and assessment. Many of the new ideas are, first of all, conceived in a university environment, prototyped in a university environment, and tested as part of a thesis of a grad student. But we could facilitate the transition of those new ideas into reality by strengthening the business-academia linkages. And there was a suggestion that what we need is some sort of think tank or incubator for new technologies that would address SDG issues. So that's a recommendation that we would like to bring forward. In terms of the introspection, there was a feeling, as was mentioned in the previous session, that professors at many universities have to worry about publications, and that's their criteria, publish or perish. If those review criteria for performance were broadened to recognize and reward applied technology development, evaluations and assessments, work done in the developing world and so forth, even data sharing, that it would facilitate achieving some of these goals. We discussed the need to think about transdisciplinary science. There's not much motivation for scientists to address that. How do we integrate that into the evaluation system at a specific university? How do we get to agencies like the National Science Foundation in the US to start funding more transdisciplinary research? And how do we train program managers how to peer review those sorts of proposals, because they don't know? So a bottom line here, I think that this meeting is, we're off to a good start in terms of opening up the process so that it's civil society, it's academia, business, governments talking to each other. I think that's the direction that we need to move in. So hopefully we'll establish a framework through this process that will allow us to continue this for the next 15 years, because I think that's what's really needed to achieve the goals that we're setting for ourselves.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Last but not least, Bart, please, from the perspective of, well, the next generation, or you're almost reaching the target of already having a younger generation behind you. So, but from the perspective of the youth, what do you consider to be the biggest obstacles? Why doesn't all these beautiful things we've discussed yesterday, why don't they happen everywhere? Why we still have to face problems?
Well, there is indeed some you can point at, but before going to the content of that, I just want to come back of my age and the fact that I represent young people. In fact, we had yesterday a civil society session which was composed of the different segments of civil society. So we both had women's representatives, NGOs, youth, indigenous people, farmers. It was a very rich and dynamic session. And I just want to say this to make sure that it's visible and understood that civil society for us is composed of very diverse segments, but who often manage to productively work together. And I want to thank all of them who are here in the room, because we had a great session, I think, yesterday. Turning then to the question on the obstacles, indeed a very important one. I'll go through 3 obstacles very in short, and then 3 solutions which I think are delivered through or with or by civil society. And the first obstacle is one that has been mainly raised, I think, by our convener for the WASH session, Shauna Curry from Coast in Canada. And from her experience and also the broader experience of other participants, it was very clear that often the failure of projects come from the fact that local people cannot manage the technology. So the obstacle is very clearly that when technology cannot be managed or operate or maintained locally, it will never constitute a sustainable and certainly not an effective solution. The solution then being, of course, that both the design from the beginning and the implementation of technological interventions must happen in close cooperation with local communities to make sure that they are effective and that local communities have the capacity to manage. Then a second obstacle is the price of technology, and it's something which is quite often discussed already. But it came out of our discussion yesterday that the pricing of technology is still a very crucial aspect, and that it has to be thought through very, very carefully. Improvident setting of the price of technology for locals will almost in all cases result in a failure of the objectives. And the solution is maybe not that simple. It's not making it free or making it very affordable at one side. It's the solution is, we think, that technology should certainly be affordable for locals, so to ensure that financing is not a constraint which keeps the locals from benefiting from the technology. But at the same time, we really believe that free technology is not a solution either, so local communities should financially contribute to the technology. And then a third and last obstacle is that the technology is often not adapted to the specific needs of a community or to their local context. So again, when designing a technological intervention, not only for looking at their capacity to manage it, but also for designing the solution, a long-term vision is essential, so to ensure that the intervention will be adapted to the local needs, but also to the context, and even that's these days a changing context, for instance, due to climate change. So when turning to the solution again, first of all, we want to overcome that obstacle. If you want to overcome it, we have to forget about technology interventions which are just from above imposed by governments or by NGOs, because in this context of imposing technology interventions, we are not only as civil society pointing at the big international donors or at governments, it's also a problem often created or enhanced by NGOs, so we all share a responsibility in that to go away from that vision, and we need to go to a vision where technological interventions should be based on the demands and on the needs at the local level and designed with the meaningful participation of the communities. And I won't come back on what John Bosco said yesterday about participation, but I hope if there is one thing that you'll take from civil society and this conferences, that it's going to be that message of Jean Bosco. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bart. Thank you very much to our panelists for having brought answers to these 3 questions. Before we start the discussion with the audience, is there any key message you would like to pass to the audience, something which hasn't been tackled yet in these discussions, something you would still like to bring to the audience before we launch the discussion? About tools and technologies, a very short, to the point key message you would like to bring to the people. Otherwise, we open the floor. Well, majority votum. Ladies and gentlemen, from your perspective, anything, any issues which have been discussed in the sessions, you all participated yesterday, which haven't been brought forward, any important key messages? Because the purpose of this conference is to compile the tools, to report on the tools, and to see which tools needs to be integrated into the development of the SDGs. And we have...
Good morning, thank you. My name is Shauna Curry. I'm the CEO of Center for Affordable Water and Sanitation Technology. We're 13 and a half years old, and our sole focus over this time has been to focus on what our academic had mentioned earlier, was on the knowledge translation and the importance of the knowledge translation and the transfer of simple, appropriate technologies. So I'd like to speak to one of Bart's final points in terms of adaptation and the design for the local context. The important thing to understand here is that it doesn't have to be a different technology for every single local context, is that what's important is having options that local communities can understand and then adopt the ones that are appropriate to their context. And so the conditions for success, to speak to that we've learned over our time in this knowledge translation is, 1, it's self-help technologies, such as a very important one is the household water treatment. It is something that any individual household is able to implement in their home and take care of their water quality immediately. And then the components of successful implementation is threefold: create demand, so the demand creation portion, and demonstration projects are an important aspect of it. You can use demonstration projects multiple times in every community, and then that is how, at the same time, you build capability for the local organization or community to develop their management skills, understand the technology, and then at that point, they're able to scale up and replicate. So the demand creation, products and services, often that's the sole place people focus their energy as the 50%. Products and services in the supply chain is a critical component. Thirdly is the monitoring for improvement. So the products and services, demand creation, and monitoring for improvement. And then encompassing all of that is the human capability to do all of that. And the financing, both on the software and the hardware. So
sorry, allow me. I've been very rough and rude to our panelists. So I think also the interventions from the audience should be pointed, focused, and short. So we have a real chance for interaction later on.
Sure. That's my contribution. And I'll conclude by saying, taking this approach, there's our organization through training, we have reached 9.5 million people with access to safe water, driven by local organizations.
Thank you very much. There's a gentleman behind you who would actually have the floor.
Okay, I will bring very to the point issues. I think that sometimes the beauty is on details. Small is beautiful, or maybe beautiful, and if you put effort in some things, maybe easier than putting effort in everything, and sometimes I'm being less efficient. So the first point relates to new technologies, and you mentioned desalination, which is a technology which has been very slowly developing because it's very much energy consuming, and the price has stayed very stable, about $1 per cubic meter of water, something like this. So this can be used for certain applications like tourism, where you can add a little bit more to your hotel bill and nobody notices. Can be used in urban areas, maybe, but in agriculture, for certainly not. However, some of the new technologies, the nanotechnologies and the materials, new materials, can give us hope in desalination. The graphene technology, as you know, are these plates with a thickness of 1 atom of carbon, have many different uses, and one of them, which is said, is that this can reduce dramatically the cost of desalination. But then they say, well, this will be in a matter of 20 years. I don't know if the water community should not make pressure in order to put funds on this and reduce this 20 years to 5 years or something like that. So it's one case where a specific action could be interesting. The other point, there was a reference to the water efficiency use in agriculture. We always say that's inefficient, and that's true. But we tend to speak to the pre-harvest part of the producing the products. But after we collect the products on the post-harvest, there is also a lot of inefficiency in using food products in transport, processing, commercialization, and eating. And at home, the amount of food that we throw is immensely. And some figures, some studies which have been done mainly, for instance, at CV in Stockholm, puts a figure of about 30 to 40% of reduction of waste food. That will be possible. So 30 or 40% of reduction of food on waste could mean 30 or 40% of reduction in water or something like that. And since water consumes 70% of the whole, in average, of the water in the world, this could be extremely significant and facilitate the problem to other areas. Now, the third and final point related to clothes of Chinese women and westernization in general.
Excuse me, I've been very rude to a beautiful young girl, and I'm tempted to be very rude to a very wise elderly gentleman now too.
Yeah.
And my ear was pulled by our supreme boss, by Josefina, saying we should also focus on questions, not on statements in this.
It's, I'm referring to this as a symbol of economizing water in products that will be used by the emerging countries. So virtual water, in a way, water which is embedded in products. The main product in embedding water is, again, food. And we should make all efforts to get diets, to try to arrange things in order to get diets which are not only healthy but less water consuming, because, again, agriculture is 70% of the consumption. And this will come very soon, and it will be much more important than growth in population. Also is the growth in the standards of living in these countries. If we could all be vegetarians, there will be a tremendous economy in the world. India is very much on that track. China is less on that track. but I think it's a problem that deserves more attention than it has received.
Thank you very much. And again, please, we have a intervention, and I hope it will be a question and not an intervention.
Sure,
again,
sure.
Josefina, she is the master of ceremony, and also my colleague Elisa, they both told me, focus on questions, encourage questions. There is a very well qualified panel here. Please grill them.
Yeah, thank you very much, all the panel, and thanks to our youth leader. But my question goes to Professor Roger Falconer. Actually, we met in 1990 as when I was hydroinformatics student in UNESCO IHE. My promoter is Professor Michael Abbott. Having stayed 25 years in the Western Europe, in 2011 I went back to Myanmar and started being a whip of Myanmar water sector. So Professor Falconer mentioned the non-closure agreement, that the culprit is me. I asked the Dutch company Deltares to sign the non-disclosure agreement of all our data. I would like to explain only in 2 sentences that what is the background.
But we want questions, not explanations.
No,
Sorry.
Because if we don't say the recipe, the professor and the audience and the Deltares, they cannot come up with a solution. Okay? So the thing is, the water, we have a problem that water is free, given from the God. So we cannot put the price on water. The same mirror image, the data owned by the state. Now the other company came to the committee. I'm the committee member, the national level apex body, chaired by the vice president too. And then the expert group, I'm the secretary of the expert group. So I advised that big boss. So they said, Nini, this is our property. So when the company comes, they own the thing equally you were talking about. Okay? We have to get the continuous recording, and that is owned by either any company, maybe Coca-Cola. Okay? Then they said the government doesn't want to bag back the data from the company. So please tell me, how do we solve this very big perspectives?
Well, I totally disagree with you that it's your water. The water that lands in my country comes from the United States, for example, so they would have just as much a claim over that water. We have evapotranspiration in the United States and so forth. Water is global, and it belongs to all of us. So I fundamentally disagree with that point. And I believe the data should belong to all of us globally. If water is to be regarded as owned by the whole globe, effectively, then I believe the data should be available to all of us too, because it would make a big difference in our advancements, in my view.
Pardon me, I do agree, because as I said, I was trained in UNESCO IT, trained by
Very good.
Professor Abbott,
Very good.
trained in Netherlands. But what I'm saying is, come back to our own country and facing with these old-timers, please tell me the recipe that how do I make that notion water is owned by everyone. And if you open the policy book where my quote is there, water belongs to all of us. That was the opening statement.
It's no good
but my incapability is we have to, like civil society people, we have to convince the governments who hold the old perspective, and how do we make them to come to our way of thinking? But we are together.
Well, it's no good me coming, because I'm an old-timer too. I've got a senior rail card now in my country.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope maybe over coffee there's more room to elaborate on this question, which is pertinent. But we have room for 2 more interventions, I think, before Elisa will then have to try to wrap up the gist of this session.
30-second question. My name is Luís Simas from the Portuguese Drinking Water Regulator. In all the sessions and in your presentations, I didn't hear anything about water safety planning. Water safety planning is a tool. Water safety planning tackles some of the obstacles that you mentioned, the local adaptation, the local maintenance, the affordability. It is tailor-made for each situation, so I'd like to hear from you why not referring to water safety planning that is now also applied to sanitation safety plans. Thank you.
Who would like to pick the question? Who would like to give the answer? To whom would you like to put the question? You know, I can be very mean also to our panelists. Whom would you like to grill with your question?
Academia and government.
We didn't discuss that explicitly, but I think that there was a recognition that national frameworks related to water safety were something that we would want to support. And when the research needs are identified, then academia could jump in and help with the solution. It could also help with identifying how one might interact with a policy such as that and get community involvement and government commitment to it. So there are many roles to play, but the issue is finding a person within academia who has an interest and wants to help you carry that forward, and providing the motivation that will assure that they'll be with you for a long time and moving forward with it. So maybe the first step is to identify what things you require from academia in order to carry that idea forward, and then begin to negotiate or interact with academia, because definitely academia is interested in issues like that.
And Josefina just brought, again, you know, I'm under strict surveillance, to my attention that most probably this question will be elaborated in more detail in the governance session. There's one session which is really dedicated to discuss, like we here doing tools and technologies. Another session will report on the governance instruments. So maybe this might be more appropriate in this context. I have a gentleman here who is already trying to get my attention for some time. We have room for 2 more quick interventions, and then unfortunately we have to stick to time, and Elisa will try to wrap up and provide us with the gist and what will be contained in the report. Please.
Okay,
1 and 2. This gentleman has been pushing already for some time.
Thank you. I'm Christopher George, also from IHR, the association which Roger Falconer is president of. My question relates to the message on the screen behind, problems of implementing technology tools. This is a briefing note that was given to all of us for the conference, which is quoting from the UN General Assembly 2012. Effective technology facilitation mechanism must build and expand international networks of collaboration, research, development, demonstration. We're delighted to have been invited to come along today. It's the first time that our association has been at this meeting, but we, like many associations, we're small, we're weak, we're ready to help. Our members are all over the world to address many of the issues that have been covered over the last 2 days. But it's difficult for us to participate in this type of event. The tendency to me is, we say build and expand. The tendency seems to be to create new networks all the time. And there are many, many organizations, international organizations. We were founded in 1935, ready to work on implementing the SDGs. And I just wonder whether the panel has any thoughts on how we could be more, our associations like ours, could be more involved in working with the UN to accomplish these goals which you have agreed on. Thank you.
Well, it's tools and technologies and not the goals we're discussing, but to whom would you like to ask this question?
Well, I think academia and, of course, governance as well in particular would be very relevant here. But civic society, we are civic society, international civic society.
Well, the first question was answered by academia. Maybe we can pass this on to governance. Roger, please.
Can I very quickly deal with this chap's question?
Sure.
I think it would be better to focus on clothes rather than food. Now, in my view, Barack Obama and David Cameron are perfect examples of what we should try to do. They both wear the same suits every day of the week. They both wear white shirts all the time, and they both wear the same ties. They are perfect role models. Because if the rest of the world did what they did, we would address nearly all these problems just like that. Sorry, I've forgotten your point. Networks. Well, as president of IHR, we would welcome collaborating. We feel we have a lot to contribute, and I think we have a lot to learn as well.
Okay. Has this answered the question? No?
It's a question really, I think, for you as the UN, how can these mechanisms of meetings like this build on existing networks, not create new networks? It's a very there's no simple answer to it, but I think it's something that in the future meetings that you attend, for example, it's very difficult for us to participate in the World Water Forum even. The costs are way above the budgets that we have available. It's a question that will be always there.
Well, maybe that's a mean way to answer it, but I tempted to say we can be embracing, we can be open as the UN, we can invite people, but we cannot foot all the bills for everyone. And
Bill all the food either.
You spoke about creating new networks, the request, and maybe once in a while there is also a competition between networks. And again, you would have to sell to your stakeholders or whoever who signs the bill in the end of the day, why you should do it. And
May I interject here, because we're interactive with the audience. Rudolf Cleveringer, Global Water Partnership. I think we shall elaborate this not only bilaterally, thank you, but also in the governance section later in the afternoon.
The question was put to me, and this is not a UN statement, but it's how I can answer it and how I would answer it. Say we can be embracing, we can allow, we invite everyone, but again, we cannot foot the bill for everyone. And in the end of the day, also every UN organization has to request the funds from governance, from different sources. So, yes, and we've all experienced this over the last couple of years. The size of the cake has shrunk, and we have to adjust to it, and this will be a necessity.
Maybe if I can just add there, if I understand your concern and question, then maybe some tools, as I explained, like the Water Action Hub, where actually accessible, where you can see who is, which party is involved in what type of projects, or which party is interested to start up what type of project. These tools can help on bringing the people together and having the network actively working.
And again, what was presented
free of charge,
by our colleague from the civil society, social media. These days, maybe it's an outdated fashion to bring 150 people together. It's still the way how we operate, and I still think that interpersonal interaction is a very important aspect of a network. But again, things change. We're in a rapidly changing world, and Bart, please.
Yeah, I just want to come back on that specific question. I can't speak for your specific constituency, I can speak for youth. And for youth, we see recently that there is a lot of positive changes in the UN. Ban Ki-moon has appointed a special envoy on youth, and his specific mandate is to create the partnerships of existing youth organizations to contribute to the post-2015 development agenda. So that's a great example. I think that addresses the challenge you raised, because he's not creating something new. He's just working with the existing youth organizations. And I also think about then youth participation. It's a long-term process. I think the water sector is a great example of how this has advanced, but it wouldn't be sustainable, and it will be in contrary with our own messages if we would like to see ourselves fully integrated and fully financed in a term of 2 years or 3 years. So I believe it's a long-term process. You have to prove the importance of your place. You have to get familiar and integrated in the whole system, and it comes with multiple milestones, one after another. So speaking from my constituency, I think that the challenge which you raise is being addressed and being overcome in this very precise years and in this period.
And again, let's focus back on tools. That's why we're here. Which tools are there? Which tools can be used in achievement of the SDGs, and why doesn't it happen? And I think that's the last question I can take in terms of time. A gentleman.
Mine was not a question, just to provide additional information. My name is Selashi. I come from UNDESA. On the issues of really contributing to the SDG process, I think we have to note that the future we want the Rio Plus 20 outcome, as well as the so-called high-level political forum mechanism, actually recognizes the major groups and the networks like IHR and others, academia, private sector, NGOs, and so on, to provide input to the implementation of sustainable development goals. Unlike MDG, it is both bottom-up and top-down process. Recognizes the input of all stakeholders. Therefore, major groups are actually recognized to sit in the high-level political forum to provide means of solution as well as input toward this reviewing progresses and so on. Therefore, there is significant opportunity, unlike MDG, to provide relevant input in terms of science, tools, knowledge, and so on.
Thank you very much, Yendesa. Well, looking at my watch, I'm tempted now to hand over to my colleague Elisa from UNEP. She has, I think, the unthankful task now. She will have to report on this session, and she will now give us an outlook in terms of what her answers in the report might be, what she has collected from our audience and from the panelists.
Christian, I think the worst task is being in between us and the coffee break, so I'll try really to be very, very quick. I captured a very positive feelings in terms of having been able to identify a large number of technology solutions and knowledge around how to implement, adapt those technology solutions to different contexts. What I felt coming out from the discussion was that what is still not there is sometimes the application, the adaptation, the dissemination of those solutions to a wider context. And the question that comes out is, why is this the case? We heard strongly arguments around the business case for water and sustainable development being made. So how can we work harder on providing information that would enable the business case to be clearly set or to be easier to be made? I also heard a very strong link, and this goes back to some of the points we opened on the first day of discussion, very strong link to other means of implementation and the discussion which is going around them. I heard strong linkages with governance and how water governance is a very important element and factor into water technology investment decision. I heard a strong link to economic incentives, financial mechanism. I heard how can clearer information around either water pricing or the full cost of natural resources being taken into consideration into decision making being a very important element. I heard references to how water footprinting, certification schemes and label being an important driver from the market perspective into promoting more technology uptake. I also heard very loud and strong the social dimension of technology. And I heard it into, let's say, a two-way path. So how can we be stronger into making sure that we take into consideration local needs, capacity, willingness, interest, knowledge and tradition into adapting to the local context. But I also heard reference both in the civil society discussion, and I'm aware it also came out strongly in the media discussion, into how can we build on local knowledge, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, into shaping them into solutions that can be disseminated more broadly. One additional point which I also liked and came out on the first day was, let's look out of the water box into what is referred to water technology solution, or more broadly, technology solution. How can some of the problems that we attach to water actually need other type of technology solution to be addressed? And, well, the last recommendation that I will surely take on board in the upcoming discussion on the interagency group on technology is that here there is really a wealth of tools and options and mechanisms that need to be captured there. And a lot of them came out both in this wrap-up session and in the presentations of the last day. So thank you very much to everybody for the insightful discussion. And this leads us with a very positive feeling to be brought in the other discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Josefina just has, I think, a small administrative announcement.
No, I'm
Or
just trying to, I'm just trying
whatever,
to...
an announcement.
I'm just managing the flow, nothing else, don't worry. So now I think it's coffee break. We are going to be back here at 11:45. I know there is not a lot of time, but let's try, okay? Because I think it's very important. The break times is very important because now all of you are having a lot of information and you want to discuss it. But still, we have to give the time to the sessions as well. So please come in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
I was a bit disturbed by the fact that I with my computer this morning. So it was coffee over the keyboard, no good.